Chapter 11. So Rodney leaned on the timber fence surrounding the practice area as he watched the new battle school cadets going through their weapons drill. He rubbed his chin thoughtfully, his eyes scanning the 20 new recruits, but always returning to one in particular, the broad-shouldered tall boy from the ward, whom Rodney had selected at the choosing. He thought for a moment, searching for the boy's name. Horace, that was it. The drill was a standard format. Each boy, wearing a mail shirt and helmet and carrying a shield, stood before a padded hardwood post the height of a man. There was no point practicing sword work unless you were burdened with a shield, helmet, and armor, as would be the case in a battle, Rodney believed. He thought it was best that the boys become used to the restrictions of the armor and the weight of the equipment right from the start. In addition to shield, helmet, and mail, each boy also held a drill sword issued by the armorer. The drill swords were made of wood and bore little resemblance to a real sword, aside from the leather-bound hilt and crosspiece on each. In fact, they were long batons made of seasoned, hardened hickory. But they weighed much the same as a slender steel blade, and the hilts were weighted to approximate the heft and balance of a real sword. Eventually, the recruits would progress to drilling with actual swords, albeit with blunted edges and points. But this was still some months away, by which time the less suitable recruits would have been weeded out. It was quite normal for at least a third of the battle school applicants to drop out of the harsh training in the first 3 months. Sometimes it was the boy's choice. For others, it was at the direction of his instructors or, in extreme cases, Sir Rodney himself. Battle school was harsh and standards were strict. The practice yard rang with the thudding of wood against the thick, sun-hardened leather padding on the practice posts. At the head of the yard, Drill Master Sir Carell called the standard strokes that were being practiced. 5 third-year cadets, under the direction of Sir Morton, an assistant drill instructor, moved among the boys, attending to the detail of the basic sword strokes, correcting a wrong movement here, changing the angle of a stroke there, making sure another boy's shield wasn't dropping too far as he struck. It was boring, repetitive work under the hot afternoon sun, but it was necessary. These were the basic moves by which these boys might well live or die at some later date, and it was vital that they should be so totally ingrained as to be instinctive. It was that thought that had Rodney watching Horace now. As Carell called the basic cadence, Rodney had noticed that Horace was adding an occasional stroke to the sequence, and yet managing to do so without falling behind in his timing. Carell had just begun another sequence, and so Rodney leaned forward attentively, his eyes fixed on Horace. "Thrust! Side cut! Backhand side! Overhand!" called the drill master. "Overhand backhand!" And there it was again. As Carell called for the overhead backhand cut, Horace delivered it, but then almost instantly switched to a backhanded side cut as well, allowing the first cut to bounce off the post to prepare him instantly for the second. The stroke was delivered with such stunning speed and force that, in real combat, the result would have been devastating. His opponent's shield, raised to block the overhead cut, could never have responded quickly enough to protect uncovered ribs from the rapid side cut that followed. Rodney had become aware over the past few minutes that the trainee was adding these extra strokes to the routine. He had seen it first from the corner of his eye, noticing a slight variation in the strict pattern of the drill, a quick flicker of extra movement that was there and gone almost too quickly to be noticed. "Rest!" called Carell now, and Rodney noted that, while most of the others let their weapons drop and stood flat-footed, Horace maintained his ready position, the sword tip slightly above waist height, moving on his toes in the break so as not to lose his own natural rhythm. Apparently, someone else had noticed Horace's extra stroke as well. So Morton beckoned over one of the senior cadets and spoke to him, gesturing quickly towards Horace. The first-year trainee, his attention still focused on the training post that was his enemy, didn't see the exchange. He looked up, startled, as the senior cadet approached and called to him. "You there, at post 14, what do you think you're doing?" The look on Horace's face was one of bewilderment and worry. No first-year recruit enjoyed gaining the attention of any of the drill masters or their assistants. They were all too conscious of that 30% attrition rate. "Sir?" he said anxiously, not understanding the question. The senior cadet continued. "You're not following the pattern. Follow Sir Carell's call. Understand?" Rodney, watching carefully, was convinced that Horace's bewilderment was genuine. The tall boy made a small movement of the shoulders. Almost a shrug, but not quite. He was at attention now, the sword resting over his right shoulder and the shield up in the parade position. "Sir?" he said again uncertainly. The senior cadet was getting angry now. He hadn't noticed Horace's extra moves himself and obviously assumed the younger boy was simply following a random sequence of his own devising. He leaned forward, his face only a few centimeters away from Horace's, and said, in a voice far too loud for that small amount of separation, "Sir Carell calls the sequence he wants performed. You perform it. Understand?" "Sir, I did," Horace replied, very red in the face now. He knew it was a mistake to argue with an instructor, but he also knew that he had performed every one of the strokes Carell had called. The senior cadet, Rodney saw, was now at a disadvantage. He hadn't actually seen what Horace had done. He covered his uncertainty with bluster. "Oh, you did you? Well, perhaps you might just repeat the last sequence. What sequence did Sir Carell call?" Without hesitation, Horace replied, "Sequence 5, sir. Thrust, side cut, backhand side, overhand, overhead backhand." The senior cadet hesitated. He'd assumed that Horace had simply been in a dream, hacking away at the post any way he chose. But, as far as he could remember, Horace had just repeated the previous sequence perfectly. At least he thought he had. The senior cadet wasn't altogether sure of the sequence himself by now, but the trainee had replied with no hesitation at all. He was conscious that all the other trainees were watching with considerable interest. It was a natural reaction. Trainees always enjoyed seeing somebody else being berated for a mistake. It tended to draw attention away from their own deficiencies. "What's going on here, Paul?" Sir Morton, the assistant drill master, sounded none too pleased with all this discussion. He'd originally ordered the senior cadet to reprimand the trainee for lack of attention. That reprimand should have been delivered by now and the matter ended. Instead, the class was being disrupted. Senior Cadet Paul came to attention. "Sir, the trainee says he performed the sequence," he replied. Horace went to reply to the implication obvious in the emphasis the senior cadet placed on the word "says." Then he thought it better of it and shut his mouth firmly. "Just a moment." Paul and Sir Morton looked around, a little surprised. They hadn't seen Sir Rodney approaching. Around them, the other trainees also came to stiff attention. Sir Rodney was held in awe by all members of Battle School, particularly the newer ones. Morton didn't quite come to attention, but he straightened a little, squaring his shoulders. Horace bit his lip in an agony of concern. He could see the prospect of dismissal from Battle School looming before him. First, he seemed to have alienated the 3 second-year cadets who were making his life a misery. Then he had drawn the unwelcome attention of Senior Cadet Paul and Sir Morton. Now this, the battlemaster himself. And to make matters worse, he had no idea what he had done wrong. He searched his memory and he could distinctly remember performing the sequence as it had been called. "Do you remember the sequence, Cadet Horace?" said the battlemaster. The cadet nodded emphatically. Then, realizing that this wasn't regarded as an acceptable response to a question from a senior officer, he said, "Yes, sir. Sequence 5, sir." That was the second time he had identified the sequence, Rodney noted. He would have been willing to bet that not one of the other cadets could have said which sequence from the drill manual they had just completed. He doubted that the senior cadets would have been any better informed. Sir Morton went to say something, but Rodney held up a hand to stop him. "Perhaps you could repeat it for us now," he said, his stern voice giving no hint of the growing interest he was feeling in this recruit. He gestured to the practice post. "Take your position. Calling the cadence. Begin." Horace performed the sequence flawlessly, calling the strokes as he went. Thrust, side cut, backhand side, overhand, overhead backhand. The drill's sword thudded into the leather padding in strict timing. The rhythm was perfect. The execution of the strokes was faultless. By this time, Rodney noticed, there was no additional stroke. The lightning-fast reverse side cut didn't appear. He thought he knew why. Horace was concentrating on getting the sequence correct this time. Previously, he had been acting instinctively. Sir Carell, attracted by Sir Rodney's intervention into a standard drill session, strolled through the ranks of trainees standing by their practice posts. His eyebrows arched a question at Sir Rodney. As a senior knight, he was entitled to such informality. The battlemaster held up his hand again. He didn't want anything to break Horace's attention right now, but he was glad Quirrell was here to witness what he was sure was about to happen. Again, he said in the same stern voice, and once again. Horace went through the sequence. As he finished, Rodney's voice cracked like a whip. Again! And Horace performed the 5th sequence. This time, as he finished, Rodney snapped, Sequence 3! Thrust, thrust, backstep, cross parry, shield block, side cut, Horace called as he performed the moves. Now Rodney could see that the boy was moving lightly on his toes, the sword a flickering tongue that danced out and in and across. And without realizing it, Horace was calling the cadence for the moves nearly half as quickly again as the drill master had been. Quirrell caught Rodney's eye. He nodded appreciatively. But Rodney wasn't finished yet. Before Horace had time to think, he called the 5th sequence again, and the boy responded. Thrust, side cut, backhand side, overhand, overhead backhand. Backhand side, snapped Sir Rodney instantly, and in response, almost of its own will, Horace's sword flickered in that extra deadly move. Sir Rodney heard the small sounds of surprise from Morton and Quirrell. They realized the significance of what they had seen. Senior Cadet Paul, perhaps understandably, wasn't quite so fast to grasp it. As far as he was concerned, the trainee had responded to an extra order from the battlemaster. He'd done it well, admittedly, and he certainly seemed to know which end of the sword was which, but that was all the cadet had seen. Rest, Sir Rodney ordered, and Horace allowed the sword point to drop to the dust, hand on the pommel, standing feet apart with the sword hilt centered against his belt buckle in the parade rest position. Now, Horace, said the battlemaster quietly, do you remember adding that backhand side cut to the sequence the first time? Horace frowned, then understanding dawned in his eyes. He wasn't sure, but now that the battlemaster had prompted his memory, he thought that maybe he had. Yes, sir, I think so. I'm sorry, sir, I didn't mean to. It just sort of happened. Rodney glanced quickly at his drill masters. He could see they understood the significance of what had happened here. He nodded at them, passing a silent message that he wanted nothing made of this, yet. Well, no harm done, but pay attention for the rest of the period and just perform the strokes Sir Quirrell calls for, all right? Horace came to attention. Yes, sir. He snapped his eyes towards the drill master. Sorry, sir, he added, and Quirrell dismissed the matter with a wave of his hand. Pay closer attention in future, Quirrell nodded to Sir Rodney, sensing that the battlemaster wanted to be on his way. Thank you, sir. Permission to continue? Sir Rodney nodded assent. Carry on, drill master. He began to turn away then, as if he'd remembered something else. He turned back and added casually, Oh, by the way, could I see you in my quarters after classes are dismissed this evening? Of course, sir, said Quirrell, equally casually, knowing that Sir Rodney wanted to discuss this phenomenon, but didn't want Horace to be aware of his interest. Sir Rodney strolled slowly back to the battle school headquarters. Behind him, he heard Quirrell's preparatory orders, then the repetitive thud, 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 thud of wood on leather padding began once more.